Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of Scholarly Snippets. I'm your host, Stephen Sorensen. Today, I'm joined by a guest who is a South African historian who is completing his PhD in history at Stellenbosch University near Cape Town in South Africa's Western Cape. He holds a I looked up how to say this. Help me out here, Garrett.
An
What's it?
MSc?
MSc, right?
Yes.
What
Masters
is
in Science, yes.
Master's in Sciences? Thank you.
Mhm.
He holds a Master's in Sciences in African Studies from Scotland's Edinburgh University, where he graduated with a distinction for his dissertation after creating a video documentary thesis on the experiences of South African war veterans, the first dissertation presented in such a medium in the department's history. He completed his undergraduate in clinical psychology and history and honors in history at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa, and has primarily focused his research on experiences of war veterans of the Cold War in southern Africa. Specifically, he studies the South African Border War, a little known but devastating conflict that took place from 1966 to 1989 on the Angolan Namibian border. His other professional research interests include the psychosocial impacts of the Cold War on South African society, the treatment of war veterans in post conflict society, the Rhodesian Bush War, environmental history and the impact of war on ecology and human migration, African and colonial involvement in World War I and II, the legacy of Shinkolabwe. How do you say that?
Shinkulubwe.
Shinkolubwe uranium mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the geopolitics of climate change and Antarctica. For fun, he also dabbles in research surrounding southern African archaeology and paleontological findings, African witchcraft and mythology, and the impact of modern zoological facilities on animal conservation. Garrett grew up surrounded by animals on his family's conservation facility, the Kango Wildlife Ranch,
That's it, yes.
in Oudtshoorn, South Africa.
You're not going to be able to pronounce it, but the closest is Oudtshoorn. Oudtshoorn.
Oudtshoorn, that place, South Africa. His first friends were a baboon named Stinky and a cheetah named Alpha. He worked at the facility until he left to begin his academic career, but often goes back to help out. His jobs there have included reptile curator and crocodile wrangler, raising cheetahs, lions, and tiger cubs, marketing, and heading the facility's unique international volunteer program. He has been lucky enough to travel to over 53 countries and has visited every continent, including Antarctica, but excluding Australia. He is a regular contributor to the UK's finest militaria magazine, The Armourer, and is often a speaker at local public history events and academic conferences. He runs a website and a Facebook page called Citizen Historian, which features a variety of self written articles covering his massive range of interests. He hosts a podcast of the same name, though it is all on hiatus until he completes his PhD in early 2021. He's also an avid metalhead, photographer, cook, bass player, and gamer, and is currently getting ready to launch a history and conservation themed Twitch channel. Garrett, how are you doing?
Well, I didn't realize that the write-up was that long. I should have read it out.
It was
That's
quite a lengthy introduction, but I think it
yeah.
was all worthwhile reading because that is such a fascinating background that you have. So I'm excited to talk to you and get your perspective. But first, let us know how you're doing. How are you doing today?
No, no, great. Great under the circumstances. Unfortunately, our country, like many countries in the world right now, are in lockdown. We have one of the strictest lockdowns at the moment, so we're not allowed out at all unless it's a medical emergency or for groceries. Although we're given time between 6 and 9 in the morning to go for some exercise, but we're trying to just stem the tide of COVID at the moment. And yeah, so we're basically just locked in our homes. I was working from home anyway, so it's not too different from me. Although my dogs are not enjoying the fact that we're not going for daily walks anymore.
Mm-hmm. And right, you're in South Africa,
Yes.
right? So yeah, that's interesting. They've got a stricter lockdown than we do here. Ours just
Yeah,
got.
I think that's related because a significant portion of our population lives in townships and fairly poverty-stricken. So it's harder to manage a outbreak in such circumstances than it would be in many other countries. So this is to kind of prevent a mass outbreak in some of the poorer areas of the country.
I see. Cool. So yeah, you have a lot that we just went over in the introduction. You got a master's of sciences. You're going for your PhD. You've got a bachelor's in psychology and history, and honors in history. What originally got you into history?
Well, originally I wasn't actually interested in history. In fact, I remember I did it in high school, but I wasn't very interested in it as a subject. I enjoyed history, watching films, documentaries. I read the occasional book, but it wasn't what I was intending to study. I left school first in end of 2004. Just as a point, our because we're in the southern hemisphere, our school year runs from February to November, December. So for us, we start the school year in February and end in December. So I left end of 2004. I matriculated, and then I started at film school actually in Cape Town. I wanted to create film documentaries. I was mostly interested in animal documentaries at the time, but after studying film for a while and at the facility I was at, the institution I was at, um, I kind of realized that you have to really be someone who's comfortable with making lots of advertisements before you can start making it big in documentaries. And I wasn't very comfortable with that. I'm not interested in advertising. I really just wanted to film what I wanted to film. So I decided I wanted to leave and study something else, which was my primary interest at the time, which was psychology. So I mentioned I've worked at the Kenga Wildlife Ranch most of my life, and I left school. I went and studied. Then I quit the program there. I finished a year and quit the program. Went back to work at the facility for a year. While I was there, I was studying psychology through a correspondence course. Then I went and applied to Rhodes University, which is one of the finer institutions in the country, but also one of the smallest. I think when I was there was only about 6,000 students total. Now it's almost doubled, I think. But I went to study psychology and journalism there. And just for fun, I picked up English literature, history, and classic civilization studies just to,
Just for fun.
enjoy myself on the side. Yeah, just for fun. And people kept asking me, why aren't you studying zoology? And animals are definitely a huge passion of mine. They really are. But I also felt that I'd learned a lot just living with animals. I'd learned a lot about their behavior, and I didn't want to study that and I don't want to sound arrogant about it. I already knew quite a bit, and I didn't want to go study that. I wanted to study something else, which was interesting me. And then while I was in my first year, history and psychology started becoming more and more appealing. I started really getting into the stories, especially military history. So, come the end of my first year, I dropped journalism. It's a running joke in my friend circle about how many subjects I've dropped and picked up, but history became the one that was consistent. And for my second and my third year, I started focusing more and more on history and psychology, and then subjects that backed that up, like politics and such. By the end of my time there, I was mostly focusing on psychology. I was considering studying war veterans. I was very interested in PTSD, and I was also interested in criminology. So I was interested in why people commit crimes and the trauma surrounding that. I was interested in military crimes and such. And I was considering going to do my master's in Portsmouth University, as they have a really good criminology program there. Portsmouth University is in the UK. However, I ended up doing my honors in history at Rhodes, and I chose that because come my third year, my professor, my supervisor, started digging his claws in and, kind of, or have you thought about doing our honors program? And what about all this really interesting stuff? And this is what you could do for your project. And it just, talking about war veterans just really sounded interesting. And then while I was in my fourth year there, my honors year, he brought up the South African border war. And I hadn't heard about it until then. I was vaguely aware that there had been a conflict that South Africa had been involved in. My father he served in the Navy. My uncle served in the Air Force. So, I was aware that there was some conflict. But like many people, I assumed it had something to do with apartheid, not necessarily a conflict in and of itself. Um, so I started getting more interested in that and started learning more, started taking the courses surrounding that. And I realized that there was this massive untold story happening in South Africa. At the time, there were only a handful of books that were written about it, very little research done about it. And my supervisor supervised my first project, which was a thesis about a specific battle during the South African border war called the Battle of Quita, Carneval, which is a very controversial battle. I won't go into it right now because it's a fairly involved story, but that piqued my interest, and I started researching more into it, and I realized that there were so many men and even women, white and black and Cuban and Russian and all these different nationalities who had been involved in this conflict, but whose stories had not been told or even analyzed fully. So I started really digging into it and really trying to uncover that. And my honors year, I recorded a documentary. I interviewed a few veterans. I spoke to them about their experiences and kind of put it all together in a documentary. And my professor was very supportive. I didn't get a very good mark for it in the end because the department had no idea how to mark a video thesis. I did a written component as well, but they had no real idea of how to mark it. So it was unique
It was
and
a first
interesting.
for them, right? That had
Yeah.
never ever been done before.
Well, see, now I've done it twice. So at Rhodes, I did it, and they had no idea what to do with it. But then at Edinburgh University in Scotland, I was invited up there specifically to do a project like that. So after I finished at Rhodes, I wanted to go study further and do my masters, and that's when I was contacted by the University of Edinburgh, their Centre of African Studies department. There was a lecturer there who was doing a pilot program on if students can do video dissertations in a kind of historical political science background and see if it works. And she had seen my work and thought maybe I could pull it off. So I went up there 2011, 2012 is when I did my master's in the UK. And yeah, again, first time in that department, did a video thesis with a written component. It was very well received. I received a distinction for it, which was great. And again, interviewed some veterans, and I used previous footage and new footage, spliced it together, made a brand new story. That story is available on YouTube. It's called Stories, Shadows, and Dust. It's about 30 minutes long. Please forgive the quality. It is student made.
I can get a link to that in the description too, so that when people are listening to this, they can just scroll down afterwards and check it out.
Definitely. It's on my blog as well, The Citizen Historian. It's called thecitizenhistorian.com. I'll give you the link for that as well. It is on there, and along with links to my other work. And
I'll put all that
writing.
Stuff in the description. I think there's tons of room to fit a lot of stuff there. So
yeah, so I did African studies while I was there. The main reason I went up there was after I'd written my honors thesis, I sent the honors thesis to the former chief of staff of the army of South Africa. So he was the top brass, and I basically asked him in my youth, what do you think? And he tore it apart. Of course he would. I was like 21 or 22
it was a
at
very
that
negative
point.
response.
Yeah, it was. But I took a very positive spin from it because the main thing he said was there's not enough international perspective in it. And I realized he's right. I have lived in South Africa most of my life. I had studied it mostly from a South African perspective. I need to see how the rest of the world sees South Africa. So that's when I decided to take that Edinburgh offer. And while I was there, I did interview South Africans again for the thesis, but I really made a point of studying the more international perspective around South Africa and around Africa in general, which is why I did the African Studies program there. And it's a fantastic program. People there are amazing. And I learned a lot about my continent that I didn't know before. And I met so many amazing people from Ghana and Nigeria and Botswana and from other parts of the world as well, America and even China, all coming to learn about Africa. So for me, it was amazing. And while I was there, I kind of reaffirmed that I really wanted to learn more about veterans and the war that happened but also wanted to tell their stories. And when I came back, again, I worked at our wildlife ranch for a year while I was deciding what I wanted to do. And then that's when I decided to do my PhD, which is then at Stellenbosch University, which is near Cape Town. It's in the Wineland area. So most people who come to South Africa know that if you come to Cape Town, the next thing you do is go on the Wineland tour. So you just drive up to the various vineyards and you have yourself a red wine, a white wine, and a red wine, and a white wine, and you just float around there. And the university's smack in the middle of this lovely wine route. So,
Sounds fun.
Needless to say, almost every one of our conferences is sponsored by various wine routes. But yeah, it's a great university. I've been there since 2014. My study was only supposed to take about 3 or 4 years, but it's been almost 7 years now.
So yeah, you've put a lot of time into your education. You kind of went into some of the different, or all the different schools that you went to. You've pursued a lot of different degrees, and you've obtained 3 so far, or you've got 2. You're working on your third.
Yeah, so the PhD will be the third. I've done a couple of certifications. Right now, I'm doing an archaeology certification. Just for, instead of just focusing purely on the PhD, I also want to have a little bit of other things to focus my mind on. And I've always been interested in archaeology.
Could you explain the difference between a degree and a certification?
Okay, so a degree is usually provided by a higher institute. So it'll be a university of some kind or an accredited institution. Usually that will have a lot of peer review around it. It will be ratified by various educational bodies, sometimes government involvement. A certification is more something done by private enterprises. So for example, I'm doing this through a UK-based company called Dig Ventures. So they are a group of certified archaeologists, and they're certified by a council grouping in the UK who are certified there by archaeology authorities and cultural and government authorities. So they're not a higher they're not a higher education institution.
Mm-hmm.
They don't do exams and such, but through their online program, you learn the theory. You learn kind of what you would in a first year of archaeology at a university, and but there's no exam involved. So in that way, it's kind of like if I appeared at a dig site with the certification, they would give me some low-level stuff to do until they could ascertain whether I was, good at what I was doing and I wasn't going to break anything. But right. I would be slightly more qualified than someone without.
Sweet, thanks for that information. So yeah, you talked about your schools a bit, but what were some of the major influences for the schools that you ended up picking? Like, what were some factors that contributed to your final choices?
Right. Well, I grew up in the tiny town of Oudtshoorn, as I mentioned before. So you spell that Oudtshoorn. It's Old Dutch, I believe. I'm trying to remember now what the translation, but it's like most towns and places in South Africa. It's got Dutch origin in terms of name. So the town itself is quite small. I think there's only 53,000 people, might be more, might be less. But it's a fairly well-known town. It's known as the ostrich capital of the world. And in fact, up until about the 1940s, every ostrich feather in the UK was pretty much from that town. So if you see any of those old Victorian photos where you see people with ostrich feathers in their hair and all of that, all came from that town. But yeah, it's so almost everyone my age in that town, when we left school, a lot of them went to Cape Town. So that was kind of the default thing you do. You leave your tiny Afrikaans town and you go to a big city. So some went to Johannesburg, for example, which was about 12 hours north. And so the rest of us went to Cape Town, which was about 4 hours west. So I ended up there because I like Cape Town. I went there when I was younger for holidays. It's a beautiful city. It's got Table Mountain, absolutely stunning. And it's got multiple education institutions. But I wanted to go to film school. And the only 2 film schools that were worth their salt at the time were in Johannesburg or Cape Town. I did not like Johannesburg. It's way too big of a city for me. So Cape Town was the next option. So then that's why I chose that.
So even population size contributed a bit to your decision.
Definitely. In fact, you're going to see that's a regular factor as Cape Town is smaller than Johannesburg. Grahamstown is about the same size as Oudtshoorn or smaller. And Edinburgh, though being a well-known Scottish city, is also fairly small and sparsely populated. So I don't like large crowds. That might be as a result of my upbringing. I spent most of my time around animals and not that much around people. Even though it was a tourism facility that I grew up in, I'm still far more fond of fewer people and my own time and such, which is a fairly common trait amongst historians, I believe.
Yeah, it does. It does
So
take quite a bit of lonely study.
yeah,
Like not really communication between individuals, but just reviewing a lot of data and literature.
no, exactly. You got to be very comfortable with being alone for long periods of time with your own thoughts, with your own analysis to be a good historian. So, um, yeah, Grahamstown was the next option because I wanted to study psychology, and it's rated one of the best psychology universities or to study psychology in the country. So, and it happened to be a small town, so that suited me down to the ground. And then it just so happened that the history department is really good there as well. So I just lucked out. And then, yeah, Edinburgh, I'd been there once before. It was pure happenstance. About 2 years prior, I'd gone up for their New Year's festival, which is Hogmanay. And I absolutely had a blast. I thought the city was gorgeous. I loved everything about it. And the opportunity to go study there, I just said yes in a heartbeat. It's my second home as far as I'm concerned. If I wasn't living here, I'd be living there.
So great. Just to summarize some of that, it sounds like population size, like you enjoyed sort of smaller cities, so you wanted to go to a college in a smaller city, and then also they were kind of nearby, so location was a big influence. You weren't traveling halfway across the globe to attend school, and it sounds like you
Yeah,
got into the colleges that you wanted to, though.
yeah, I was lucky in that regard. The getting into Rhodes was harder because I that's why I did a correspondence course for a year. When I left school, I didn't have when you want to go into a university, most of the time, depending on the subject you want to learn, you have to have maths or science in your matriculation set. I had mostly arts related subjects, so because obviously I wanted to study film, so I didn't think I needed science or maths, which is then why I did a year of psychology correspondence that allowed me then to get the credit I needed to get into university. So initially, I didn't get in until I did that, and then after that, it was fine. But yeah, I think for me, choosing a space was a lot to do with what I was personally comfortable with, and I say the same thing to other people. Go to where you are comfortable. My sister, for example, she came to the same university I did. She came to Rhodes for a similar reason. She liked that it was small, it was tight knit. People knew each other within a couple of days all over the town. And she liked that because we grew up in that kind of environment. Whereas my brother decided to go and study in the UK, and he went to Bath University. And Bath is another town in the UK, which is also fairly, I wouldn't say it's small, but it's a small city, but it's also got a decent population density. And the university he went to is out in a kind of the rural section of that town. So there's a theme, I think, with all of my family. But I just say pick the university, go visit the university if you can, definitely, and pick a university that resonates with you. Talk to the people there. Go and talk to the department heads that you're interested in if you can. Research it online, watch videos, talk to people on Reddit, all of that. Just find out how it feels, and ultimately, when you're physically there, you'll know if it's right for you or not. And I was lucky it was.
See, I realized that I misspoke, like, as I did it, that you only went to schools nearby, because you did go to the UK to study. In South Africa,
Yeah.
it's not a neighbor to the UK, for anyone who's familiar with their geography. But it does sound like you had sort of a history there, like your family did at least. So,
Yeah. So my family is of Norwegian and Scottish and Irish descent. So we've got a very strong family background in Scotland. Our clan name is Douglas, and we also have Campbell backgrounds there. No, we enjoyed ourselves immensely up there. When we've gone to visit a few times in the UK, we've got family there as well. And like I said, just visiting Edinburgh was just a beautiful place. So I'm possibly intending to move there again, not to Edinburgh, but the UK, depending on work opportunities once the PhD is finished. I'm kind of living how my grandparents, I'd like to live how my grandparents did, which was to follow the summer. They lived 6 months in the UK, 6 months in South Africa, and they would swap between the two. It's, you need a bit of money for that. So I'm hoping, but it's the intention. I think the two countries complement each other really well. And ideally I'd like to live a bit of in both. So.
We have quite a few people here in the States that are like that, and they live 6 months in the summer here in Michigan and then 6 months in the winter out in Arizona. So they don't have to deal with all the snow. But so, yeah, to continue on with the questions, I know you went through a lot of different majors, but was there a time, I think there was, when you changed your major, where you were pursuing one and you didn't end up getting it and you went into a different one?
Yes. So if we ignore the film background,
Right.
when I went to Rhodes, my intention was to study psychology and journalism. Journalism is what I actually signed up for, a B-Journ degree. That was my major. But by the end of that year, I decided that psychology and history were what I wanted to study. My supervisor at the time, my student supervisor, recommended I choose a BA degree, which is a Bachelor of Arts degree, because I'm still a bit undecided. And then by the end, I can decide if I want to be a B Psych or whatever the case was. So yeah, I changed that and I kept psychology as my major, and history and classics and English literature were my sub majors. And then eventually, come third year, I could pick two majors if I wanted to, and I decided to major in both history and psychology. Um, and then towards the end of my third year, history was what won out. I had to decide, what do I want to do for my fourth year? What do I want to focus on in honors? And I could have done a dual major honors, but I really wanted to focus on one particular subject. And it was really, really difficult to decide if I wanted to do psychology or history, but history won out in the end. Uh, and it was amusing because, again, my friends were constantly laughing about how I'd gone from film to journalism to psychology and then to history, and that's four major subject changes within the space of as many years.
Yeah, right. Well, what was it, the ultimate deciding factor that got you from psychology to history?
Stories. Actually, it's I loved psychology for being able to analyze and figure out the science behind the way people thought, and all of that. But there was a lot about psychology that put me off as well. And I know I'm doing a discredit to the science because it is a science, but sometimes there was a little bit of guesswork involved. It just felt like that. It didn't feel like you could really nail down things. And I find what I've just said very ironic, because in history, you can't nail down anything. Everything is up to interpretation, depending on how you do it. But for me, I've always been very into stories. I've been very into reading. I love watching movies. I love reading books. I love learning about different stories and tales. I was lucky. My family and I, we traveled a lot when I was younger, so I was always in a new place, learning new tales, speaking to people, and learning history in high school. And I think this was what puts people off of history a lot. In high school and such, history is often taught in a rote method. You have to memorize a specific date, a specific time, specific place, and people don't enjoy doing that. History, it's in the name, story, right? I don't want to say his story, high story. Yeah.
It would be more like
But
his Tory.
yes, right. But
Or
that's
high
what it is. It's
story, yeah.
story. Yeah.
So it's kind of
So
like Tall
for me,
Tales, high story.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. um, so for me, it was a lot about what did I prefer, and whereas I felt psychology is where I could probably make money, history is what was getting me up in the morning. I was excited to go to my history lectures first thing in the morning. I wanted to learn more stories. I wanted to learn about what got the world to where it was. And the big thing for me as well is I started realizing how interconnected everything was. I think a big problem with the way people view history and the way it's taught in school is taught very compartmentalized. You have the Russian Revolution, you have the American Revolution, you have colonialism. It's all very compartmentalized. There's no interconnectivity. For example, one of my favorite facts is that mammoths still roamed the earth when the Pyramid of Giza was being built. That just blows my mind. And I apologize if that's slightly incorrect. I'm sure someone in the comments will correct. They'll say, actually, it was after the Giza, but I'm pretty sure that's the fact. And for me, it was very important realizing that Africa has a story that hasn't been told properly. It's not been done justice. And I felt that I need to be the one to start unraveling and uncovering these stories. And already in the third year, I started hearing a little bit about this war that South Africa had supposedly been in. I realized that I didn't know enough about my own continent that I was living on. I only knew a little bit about apartheid history, but I didn't know enough about where I came from, where my ancestors were from, where my friends were from, the country itself, all of that. And I started just more and more, I started realizing that even if this doesn't lead to a lucrative career, I need to understand this and I need to be able to explain it to other people. I need to teach other people the story of not only this amazing continent and the conflicts that have happened and all of that, but I need to be able to provide space for people to tell their stories and for the interconnectivity of history to happen, which is why I'm very grateful that I've had such a broad variety of subjects. And to this day, I practice a very interdisciplinary approach. Psychology, politics, economics, geography, ecology studies, all of those play a very big role in my understanding of a story and how I bring it forward. So in my current dissertation, I'm taking a very strong sociology, psychology approach with under a historical umbrella, as all of those have their own approach and own way to tackle information. And for me, history is a great way to do an overarching framework and attack these other subjects and their way of doing things on. And then I'll bring in the bits and pieces that I need from these various subjects. So I lectured at the university as well. I might have forgotten to mention that, but I lectured in war and society at the university, which was Stellenbosch University. And I loved teaching the students there about their own history and how things were interconnected. And the big thing I was trying to teach them was that what I'm teaching you is stories, but what I'm trying to teach you is the skills to understand and appreciate these stories. And you can take those skills and use them anywhere. Even if history is just a throwaway subject for you that you're using just for credit, you can still use the skills from here. I've got to mention, I did philosophy in my first year at university as well. And whereas I wasn't interested in continuing philosophy, I did very much appreciate being taught logical arguments through philosophy. And I think if you are going to become a historian, philosophy is definitely a very important subject to take, even if it's just for 1 year. They teach you logical argument formats, and it's fantastic as far as I'm concerned.
Do you have any other studies that you might have forgotten about that you were pursuing in school before we continue?
It's very, very possible that they will come up. I'm trying to remember now if I have any others.
Maybe a mathematics class tossed in there somewhere.
No, that's one thing.
Degree.
Mathematics is definitely my weak point. It's my kryptonite. I'm terrible at maths.
I won't mention it.
I'm very good at algebra. Hey?
I won't mention it again then. I don't want to freak you out.
Yeah, please don't. I'm getting weak already.
So yeah, just to summarize, kind of the major change between psychology to history was you just didn't care for psychology like you did for history. Like history is the reason you got out of bed in the morning. It's something that you're super passionate about, and you just spent a few minutes answering that question, going over the reasons why you enjoy history. And so I think it's clear to anybody listening that obviously history was the right choice for you to make, because psychology only got like 10 seconds of airtime just as a mention that you didn't go for it. So
yeah. I mean, I still bring psychology. I still very much appreciate psychology. I bring a lot of it into my work, but it's not what gets me excited. I'm not a citizen psychologist.
It's there to be used for your ultimate passion, which is history. And
exactly. It's just a tool.
Yeah, to get interpretations and understanding on how these things might have taken place and unfolded. So you're in your final few months of getting your PhD in history. And that it takes a considerable amount of time to accomplish that. So when you originally started going into this, what were some expectations that you had that may or may not have panned out the way you thought they would?
Well, As mentioned before, my degree's dragged on a bit. It's up to almost about 7 years now. That was not planned. I don't think many people plan to do a PhD for that long, although it depends. Some people will go into it knowing that the study is very protracted. I entered the university in 2014 with the intention of finishing within about 3 years. However, a variety of circumstances just kept pushing the year on and on and on. Certainly, I didn't. There's so much to say about a PhD. First thing, it's not what I expected at all. My master's was taught classes, but no exams, for example. The last time I'd done exams was back in my honors year. The only exam was the dissertation. PhD, there aren't even any classes in my particular program. There are a variety of PhDs, obviously. Some involve taking classes, some involve taking exams. My one is purely research based. So I approached with a proposal for the research I wanted to do. And I went to UCT, the University of Cape Town, and I went to the University of Stellenbosch, and I went to both their departments and I presented my proposal. And I said, is this something that you would be interested in? The University of Cape Town is a wonderful institution, but they did not see scope for my research there. They didn't say that so much as they couldn't find someone who was interested in my topic. It was more like, oh, I think he can take you on. It's not really his thing, but I'm sure he'll help you. And I was like, no, I'd rather have someone who's actually passionate about it. And the head of the history department at Stellenbosch University was very interested in my topic. He's been very supportive this entire time. He's very much almost a hands-off type of supervisor. He lets me have free reign. Now that can be a double-edged sword because I would like a little bit of ass kicking every now and again to get me in the right direction. But he's very supportive when I need him. I send him an email and whatever needs to be done gets done. But yeah, he was very supportive. He got me into the program and I went from there. I spent my first year working on my proposal. I was a tutor for a while and that was great. And I think that's kind of the PhD experience most people get their first year. You do a little tutoring, maybe do a little bit of teaching depending on the institution. You might take classes, you might not, and you're working on your proposal and you're refining it and you're learning the system. But one thing about, as great as it is jumping from institution to institution, and gaining that experience, you're also a complete new person every time, and you have to relearn everyone and the system and everything, and it can be very difficult, especially in a PhD program where you don't have classes. So you don't really meet people in the same way you would in a study group. It just so happens that there were other PhD students, so I started meeting them, and I've become friends with a few of them. But it's not in the same, especially because I don't live in Stellenbosch. I live outside the town. So if you look at a map of where I live, there's Cape Town on the bottom corner of South Africa. Then to the right along the coast is a place called Somerset West. And then so Cape Town, Somerset West, and then a triangle up is Stellenbosch. So each within about 45 minutes drive of each other. And so I live outside of Stellenbosch. So I commute to do my courses and such and my coursework, which means I don't really spend a lot of time there at the department. And in my second year, I decided to get a full-time job. This was simultaneously a good decision and a bad decision. It was a good decision because I went to go work at a museum. I worked at the Iziko Museum Group, which was in Cape Town. They have 11 museums under their auspice, and I originally applied to work in their social history program, but I ended up in their marketing and events management program.
Isn't that where you wanted to avoid? The reason you didn't go into film was because you didn't want the advertisements, and lo and
exactly.
behold, here you are.
Yeah, I mean, a job's a job, but
right, yeah.
Luckily, I wasn't doing too much marketing. I was doing more events management, and that turned out to be a lot of fun. I did a little bit of events management back in university, just the occasional event here and there with my department, nothing major. But I really cut my teeth at the museum. And in many ways, as much as I would have liked to be in their history program, it was really interesting seeing a museum operate from this area and interacting with people, setting up these big events. One of the events was from PAST, which was the paleontology. No, I've forgotten it. Paleontology and Science and Technology program, something like that. I apologize to anyone from PAST watching, but they're a fantastic institution in the country that takes genetics and paleontology research to schools and high schools and teaches students evolution and science and such. And they had a big installation at our museum, which was a giant DNA helix that was interactive. It had buttons you could push and little cards that would pop up. It was a fascinating piece. And I was head of the events management team that put that together. So it was little things like that were really interesting. So I spent 2 years there, and I said it was good and bad. The bad part was that I should have been working on my PhD, but instead I was focusing more on that work there. So that was 2 years of very little research being done, and that's maybe right at the end of this, I'll mention some of the things I've learned about doing a PhD program, and now I'm at the end, some things I can recommend for people potentially thinking of going into it or already in it. But so that was the end of my third year and I left the job after that to go back to focusing on my PhD. After that, unfortunately, I received an injury, and it took about a year to recover from that. There were a few other things happening. I had to, again, my biggest issue, I think, through this PhD was a lack of funding. So I was constantly playing this dance of doing some work here, getting funding, and then going back and doing research when and where I could. I'm very lucky that the past 2 years I've managed to get a bursary, which actually it was incredible. I stumbled on this bursary by complete accident. I discovered that my great grandparents had set up a bursary, a fund for PhD students studying African orientated subjects in South Africa, and I had no knowledge of it at all. So I applied for it and mentioned that, these are my great grandparents. I've got their photo hanging in our family house, and they were interested in my work. They wanted to know more about it. And yeah, I managed to luckily get the bursary for 2 years in a row, which helped fund my studies. And that's now where I am. So now the past 2 years, I managed to focus purely on the PhD. I'm at a point now where I'm ending it. I'm in the writing phase, putting it all together. And last year, I was lucky enough as well to go on a research trip to Angola. And that's where many of the battles from the border war happened. So I got to go there with a bunch of veterans, do some field work, which I've been dying to do. Not many historians enjoy field work, or if they do, it's not the kind of field work that I necessarily enjoy. I've got a bit of a archaeology fixation there. I like to go and dig around and pick things up and measure and plot courses and all of that. Most historians would be more comfortable in archives, and I love archives as well. It's one of my favorite things to do is go into archives. And I can understand, if you're a medieval historian, chances are that the area you're researching has been built over. You're not going to be able to go and just do field work there. I was lucky I could, because I've studied an area that existed in the Cold War, so it was still there.
Well, there is. Just recently I saw on the news they were conducting archaeological excavations in the Roman Forum, and they just uncovered some new stuff there, which it had been built over, but they're still tearing it up. So I kind of relate to you a little bit. I really do enjoy archaeology and digging stuff up and getting out in the field and like sort of like a Jurassic Park type deal where you got your whole setup, and it'd be fun to do during the day, and then in the night you go to the archives and you dig through some stuff, and it'd be good to get the best of both worlds there. But
exactly, I've been lucky that I've managed to do that. I've been wanting to go to Angola for well over 10 years, so I was just very happy I finally managed to go there. And I combined the what I found there with the archive work, so I've got a really rounded representation of my research in my paper. And I think that I just mentioned as well that in case anyone was wondering, archaeologists and historians often work very closely together. Historians will have a different take on a historical period than archaeologists would. Archaeologists will often find the actual physical evidence of something, and they'll know things based on that and based on their analysis of these objects and their usages and all of that, and the area and agricultural studies and discovering what items were inside a stomach, or anthropologists, I guess, as well. Historians will be able to track down records and names, and will be able to interpret from a myriad different pieces of data what a source actually means. So they all provide different methods of analyzing the same period in time and then coming to a more conclusive whole. So for me, I have a very big emphasis in my lectures, in my work, and on my website and all these places about cross-disciplinary interaction and teamwork to achieve results, basically.
Great. And yeah, I think interdisciplinary studies are really important too because, like you were saying, with the sort of compartmentalized way of teaching history, it seems that in academic groups, the groups themselves can become compartmentalized, and so you get historians just talking to historians, archaeologists just talking to the archaeologist, psychologists only
Yeah.
talking to them, and so on and so forth. So the
Unfortunately, that's a very big problem in academia. I've noticed it in history in particular. We tend to write papers for each other. We write it for other academics, not for the public. So I've got a very big public history tint to what I do. So that's why I enjoy going out and speaking at public platforms. When you mentioned earlier about the Shinkolobwe uranium mine, the reason why that was brought to my attention before was when I was working at the Ezekiel Museum. A member from the Congolese Civil Society in Cape Town approached me and wanted to do an event on this uranium mine and the link between the Democratic Republic of Congo, the US nuclear bombings on Hiroshima, and World War II. And I had never heard of this link before. So I attended their event and I found it absolutely fascinating. And after that, I started doing my own research to the point now where I'm giving talks on it at their own events. But so if I had known about this event before I started my dissertation, I might have done this as my primary work. And basically, it is that Belgium Congo mined the uranium that was used in the two bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So the Congolese Civil Society often joins forces with the Japanese embassy that we have here to raise this piece of history with anyone who's willing to come in and attend the talks.
That's
It's a fascinating
interesting.
piece of history.
Yeah, it is fascinating. We are gonna have to start wrapping up here. We got about 20 minutes left, so I want to hit the three main questions that I have left, which is gonna be going over your favorite parts of your experience in education, the challenges, and then also that final departing message that message that you want to get out to people that are sort of considering increasing their knowledge in history and academic studies like that. So let's start out at the beginning here. What have been, like, if you had to pick one thing that was your favorite part out of all of what you've done so far and your extremely varied experiences here, what would you center in on?
There's two things, if I may.
Let's do
I'll
it.
try and
Two
keep it
things.
brief. I'm never a one thing kind of guy. The first thing I think was when I was lecturing at the university last year. I was, like I said, I was doing the War and Society course. Sorry, I mentioned that I was lecturing last year because I stepped away so I could focus more on my work at the moment. I didn't want too many other distractions. But I taught the course and I taught about the South African border war. Now, what's important to remember about that war is that it was from the 60s to the late 80s. Most people my age, I'm in my 30s, my early 30s, we have parents, uncles, grandparents who were involved in that conflict. Many men they were between the ages of 16 and 20 were conscripted by the apartheid government to fight in Namibia, in Angola, against Cuban soldiers, against Russian soldiers, against Angolan soldiers, against the conflict is varied. So if you want, I'll give a quick overview of it. But the point was that, sorry?
Yeah, let's hear it. If you just want to quick summarize it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. So very, very quick summary. So I'll try.
Yeah, right.
South Africa started off as a Dutch colony, as a country. Started off as a Dutch colony. It was a way station while other explorers were circumnavigating the world. They would start in Europe, come down to South Africa, and then move on to other areas around the continent. This was for slave trade and for spice trade and all of that. Dutch East India Company was very big involved as well. So essentially, it started as a way station and eventually evolved into something more of a settlement. A lot of people came down. Those were the Boers, the Voortrekkers, the first Europeans who were settling there. And of course, they came into conflict with people living there, including the Xhosa and the Zulu and the Khoisan, all the people that were living there. I'm going to be very brief. It's obviously very detailed and
It's a rich
more
history.
complicated. Yeah, and far more complicated than I'm making it. But eventually, Britain annexed the colony, and it became a British colony. And this was around the time when the Anglo-Boer War started. So that was the late 1800s. And there were two Anglo-Boer Wars. The first one, the Boers beat the British, and the second one, the British beat the Boers. It's a fascinating history if anyone wants to go read about it. But it's important to remember that the English and the Afrikaners had a long and bloodied past, and as a result of that conflict, there were various political movements that came out of it. When Britain beat the Boers and took over the country, it became a British protectorate, and this was at the time when there were colonies all over the world that were fighting back and rebelling. So Britain was very pulled thin. Now, the early 1900s, you have then World War I beginning. And round about World War I, World War II, South Africa eventually starts to become its own entity and becomes the Union of South Africa. And this is when we have someone called General Jan Smuts, who, if anyone's familiar with the beginning of the League of Nations, the early formation of the United Nations, or of Southern African history, or World War II history, you'll recognize that name. He was a very big figure in a lot of that. And essentially what happened was that Namibia, which is to our northwest, which was at the time called Southwest Africa, was called German Southwest Africa. So it was a German colony. Now, of course, World War I and World War II, Germany was the antagonist to the Allies, to Britain. And South Africa, being a British colony now, they told the Britain sent a missive down to South Africa to take over Southwest Africa. So the Union of South Africa attacked and invaded Southwest Africa, German Southwest Africa, and claimed it as essentially a fifth province. So shortly after World War II, Germany obviously lost its rights to many of its colonies. It lost a lot of rights all over the world, and more colonies were given out left, right, and center. The League of Nations was initially formed after World War I to prevent another war, and obviously that didn't work out. World War II happened. So the United Nations was formed after World War II. And the United Nations was far more concerned with, I want to say, native affairs. People were allowed from colonies were allowed to now petition the United Nations and say, we have been unjustly colonized by Europeans. We want to represent our own country and have our own government. This was happening in Namibia. So Southwest Africa is Namibia now. But up until the late 80s, it was still Southwest Africa. So the Herero people of Namibia were petitioning the UN to allow themselves to be self-governed. The UN initially denied because they said there's not enough population there. You have to be governed by another power like South Africa because you just can't handle your own government at this point. And the League of Nations had gifted Namibia had given Namibia to South Africa and said, here, hold on to this while we fight this war. We'll figure out what to do with it later. South Africa said, ooh, I like that. This is mine now. I needed a fifth province anyway. So, and now Namibia, if you look at your geography, Namibia borders Angola, as well as Botswana. So South Africa I'm mindful of the time as well. I'll try and keep it briefer. South Africa had Namibia. There was tension brewing about people wanting to, have Namibia or not. And Angola was a Portuguese colony, which was then undergoing its own revolution, where the Portuguese pulled out. And this was around about the time of the Cold War. So certain members of the Angolan government put out a call to Soviet influences that they would make their government communist orientated for support to win the now civil war that has erupted since Portugal has pulled out and left it to the country's natives, if you want to use that term. So that involved Cuba, because Cuba was a long time an ally of countries in Africa that were trying to gain independence. So what you have brewing now is in Angola, you have a communist bloc being set up at the height of the Cold War. You have South Africa, which is, though a pariah state because of apartheid, is still a pro-democracy state, ironically, and is being supported in secret by the US and a few other world nations. So they wanted to prevent Angola from becoming a communist foothold on the continent. And effectively, this is what led to the conflict happening. Even before that, actually, what the Herero people eventually formed something called SWAPO, which was the Southwest African Peoples Organization, effectively a liberation army. And they began guerrilla war with the South African forces in Namibia. And they were using Angola as a staging area to come across the border into Namibia. And you start seeing here border war. So South Africa started sending clandestine troops into Angola to tackle SWAPO. At the same time, this communist bloc was forming, and it became apparent that South Africa needs to put a presence into Angola to prevent the communists from getting a hold. So it's a very complicated war. There's lots of moving pieces, lots of involved. But essentially, the apartheid government needed more soldiers, and they conscripted many white students from high schools, from universities, to come and fight in this conflict. And the conflict was from 66 to 89. So it was actually 2 or 3 years longer than the Vietnam War. And it began a few years before the Vietnam War ended. So there are parallels. In fact, many times when you're reading about the border war, you hear it called South Africa's Vietnam War. And to tap it all off, if you want to understand what this war meant to the people here, imagine that when America lost the Vietnam War, that after they returned to the US, not only did they return after having lost this war, but the Vietnamese, the communist Vietnamese, had followed them to the US and were now being put in charge of the government there. Because South Africa, unfortunately, I say unfortunately, it's up to interpretation, but they effectively lost the war. But that's also not entirely accurate, because the UN did a resolution, wrote a resolution that South Africa agreed to, which saw South Africa pulling out of Angola and letting Angola manage its own affairs. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because this led to a civil war, which only ended in 2002.
Clearly, this is a very complex situation
Yes.
here, and I hate to cut you short because I like listening to this and learning more, but I think it does speak on just how complex history itself is, because this is just one war.
Yeah.
And there is so much that goes into it, much less when you start trying to get onto all the other wars that were taking place. We could talk for hours about Vietnam alone. And then
Yes, exactly.
the major world wars, and the further back in history you go, there's even less records on what was happening. And so we sort of have to figure that out. And it's a lot to cover.
I have a brief write up on my website if anyone wants to go and learn more about the war there. And like I said, once I finish my PhD, I'll be launching my own media outlets about this conflict. But let me get back to your original question about what my favorite point was. So
you're saying lecturing?
Yes, so I was lecturing a class about the war, and I was mentioning, that, and these were students about in their early 20s, and I said, chances are most of you have relatives who fought in this conflict. But the thing is, when these people came back from the war, they were not only changed, but they weren't allowed to speak about their events. The war happening in Angola was secret. They weren't allowed to talk about it. So most of these men have never spoken about their experiences.
Until just recently, right?
Until just recently. And some are still reluctant, but there are, groups that are talking about it, and movies that are coming out now. So it's coming out into the open.
So they've actually done quite a good job at keeping it secret then, it sounds like.
Yeah. Essentially, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that there was a government transition in 1994, from the apartheid government to the democratic government of South Africa, with Mandela at the head.
How many people are we talking here that were involved?
Sorry?
How many people are we talking that are involved here that have just been keeping? That's quite a lot to keep to yourself, to go through something as brutal as that, and then not be able to
I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but I think it's anywhere between 53 and 73,000 troops were in. I might be underselling it. Might be 150,000. I'm not entirely sure right now.
Quite a few people to keep a big secret like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously people spoke about it. The thing was that the country was undergoing its own mini civil war, transition of governments. There was no one to listen. No one wanted to. There was too much going on.
Hmm.
So only now that things are kind of different, they're coming out. They're processing what's happened to them, and this is what happened. So I talk about this, and I say, go speak to your parents, go speak to your male relatives, your dads, your uncles. Ask them, were you involved in this conflict? What happened? Maybe they're just waiting for you to speak to them. That's maybe why they've never spoken. And I had a student come back to me a couple of days later at the next lecture afterwards, and she just said, thank you so much for not only teaching us about this, but for telling me to go and speak to my relatives. I spoke to my dad, and for the first time in my entire life, he opened up to me. He told me about what had happened to him. He told me about what it was like over there. He told me what he did, and for the first time in my life as his daughter, we've connected.
Well, that's wholesome.
Because it's amazing, and it really, like, it got me. I felt, I didn't want to break down there in the class, but I was really,
You got me tearing
I
up a little bit.
yeah, I mean, it was just so beautiful. And this is what has happened. There's so many men living in this country now, businessmen, lawyers, doctors, who have fought in this conflict and never been given the chance to talk about what they've done, never been able to relate to anyone or their children because of their experiences. So I'm
Again,
wanting to kind of open it up to them.
Again, I would love to just keep talking to you about this, but we got about
Yes,
10
of
minutes
course.
left on the clock. Let's just hear
Yes.
about some of the challenges. You've shared a lot of information and you've kind of already talked about some of the challenges you went through, but if you had to pick two, what would be two of the main ones?
First one, right off the bat, funding. That is the biggest one.
That's a
I
common
would
one.
say, yeah, it's money matters, right?
Right.
I would say if you're going to be involved in any kind of post grad work, any major projects, make sure your funding is 100% secured. Do not go into anything unless you know you have money in the bank to cover it. The scramble of trying to, and that was my problem. That's why it's taken 7 years, because I've been trying to, as much as I've done, I've also been trying to manage just regular income to support my projects as well as writing my projects. So I'm just very grateful, obviously, for those bursaries I managed to get. But yeah, I
Mm.
wish I'd known about them when I started.
Yeah, right.
So investigate fully your funding options. Make sure you got them. The second one I would say is self-discipline. A PhD is a very different beast to anything else. PhD is all about self-discipline, managing your own research. Sorry, my dogs are barking. um, Managing your own research, managing your own time. It's very different. I think that just this subconscious level of having a class that you have to go to on a regular basis and hand in work, and you've got a supervisor or a lecturer who's there every day, and you see that all happening. That makes a big impact on how you manage your work and gives you that kind of discipline to hand in things on a regular basis. Whereas the PhD, you've got to manage that a lot yourself, but you've also got to kind of co-manage with your supervisor. In some cases, you might have a supervisor that handles everything, but in other cases, you might be like me, who has a supervisor that pretty much says, "Here you go, impress me."
Right.
And some people fail with that kind of freedom. Other people struggle a bit, and other people flourish. So it really depends on you. But those are my two big challenges, I would say.
So, yeah, just to quick summarize, it's financial issues. That is definitely a huge thing for a lot of people. And then also discipline, which I think
Yeah,
also many people would be able to relate to.
yeah.
Just really sticking on the grind and getting done what needs to be done. So, like I mentioned earlier, I want to give everyone on my series a chance to leave a message for people that are just starting to get interested in history, either as a hobby or a career. What is your message to those people?
Um, I will say that when I first started studying history and well into my PhD, I was fairly elitist about it. I felt that I was kind of special because I was studying history in an academic sense. I was privy to key knowledge that other people just wouldn't. The people who read just history books, what do they know? They're not in archives and all that kind of stuff. But as I've become more of a public historian and interacted with more people, I realized what a toxic and arrogant attitude that was. I don't think I ever outwardly said those kind of things to anyone or portrayed that, but I thought it, and I realized how wrong it was. History is for everyone, and that's actually what I've come to love about it. As much as any subject is subject to people who interpret it incorrectly, will make a mess of things, will twist facts to suit their worldviews, history is still something that's incredibly accessible. In the end of the day, it's about stories. It's about the human heart. It's about what we as a species have done in the dark pits of caves and huddled masses all the way up until going to space. You can study the history of science, the history of medicine. You can study the history of geology. You can study the history of economics. There's someone I know who's studying tobacco plantation in Zimbabwe in the early 1940s. You can study anything you want and you can become very proficient in it. The only thing I would say is maybe different for academic historians to civilian historians, if I can put it that way, is that academic historians are trained to be a lot more rigorous about sourcing your primary sources and things and being more critically minded about these sources. And we also know to analyze the person behind the source. If you can teach someone that, you can basically become a historian. So I've met a lot of people who only briefly did history in university, but I've maintained a love of it that is beyond anything even I have. And they are just hungry for more and more stories, and they learn and they learn. So I think my biggest message would be to never stop being hungry for learning and knowledge. Never be afraid to learn something new, even if it contradicts what you already know. Never be afraid to be critical about sources and about the people who've written them and all of that. But also ultimately remember that you are there for the love of stories. You're there for the love of hearing a tale about humanity and how we've reached this far. And you know what? You can even learn about the history of specific animals, and you don't even have to go anywhere near humans if you want to. That's what's great about history. It's anything for everyone, and it accesses all aspects of life. As far as I'm concerned, it's the greatest subject on the planet because I can access any piece of information about anything I want to, and I can learn a really big overview about it. And I'll never be I won't be an expert, but I will definitely be able to engage in that and fulfill my own love of knowledge.
You won't be an expert, but you will be an enthusiast. So,
Yes.
I think that was a good closing message. Just stick with it. Don't give up. There's always something to be looking at in history,
Exactly.
even stuff that's never been looked at before. So,
Yeah.
Garrett, thanks for joining me today. I had a pleasure talking with you. I wish that we could just cram 3 to 4 hours worth of time into an hour and 10 minutes, but unfortunately time doesn't work like that. So maybe I'll have you back on for another series or something here in the future. But for everybody watching, I hope you enjoyed this. If you want more content like this, it's on the Ctruth YouTube channel. If you want exclusive content from Ctruth, you can check out the Ctruth Patreon channel, which a link will be there in the description. And aside from that, I hope you enjoyed all this, and this concludes episode 11. So thanks for joining us, Garrett.
Great. Thanks for letting me be here.
Take care, everyone.